My name is Nat. For those of you who do not know, I work at an organization called Exceptional Individuals. We support neurodivergent individuals. So people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, the whole spectrum. Now, the last few sessions, we have been talking about the history of diagnosis, the label. Do we have an illness? No. Do we have a disorder? Sometimes. Do we have a difference? Yes. And kind of breaking it down. What does it actually mean to be neurodivergent? And what are the pros and cons of it? Now, today, we've been going in such a deep dive, we're going to back out a little bit and look at diagnosis for hidden disabilities or things that we cannot tangibly touch in the greater detail and finding out, are they perfect? And if not, what's the alternative? So it should be an interesting session today. Lots of great research has gone into it. So as an organization, as I mentioned, we support any sort of thing which is about thinking differently, which can be debilitating by society, but isn't inherently a disadvantage. It's more about the world we live in, which creates the barriers. We're about promoting the strengths, but also acknowledging the challenges. Now, this is our team. We're neurodivergent. We're a lovely bunch. Yeah, we've been helping people since 2015, and we love doing these webinars. It's so great that so many of you can attend and join with us. Now, our last webinar we done, which was recorded and is now live, you should check it out, is neurodiversity, illness, disorder, difference, or other. And this is looking at all the terminology because, as a kind of a very progressive organization, you would think that we're all about, it's just a learning difference, just thinking differently. But are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Is there good in having a word like disorder, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit disorder? We found out there is benefit. And illness, well, we realized that wasn't really that helpful at all, and also incorrect. So the end result, watch it for yourself, but the end thing we came up with was most of them have their merits, and there's pros and cons to all of them. Disorder is a clinical diagnosis. It means you're entitled and you get help. Difference is more empowering, but doesn't kind of hold that heavy weight to it, which something a bit more clinical does. So always interesting to know your views and opinions on that as well. Now, today's subject is a brief history of diagnosis. Obviously, it is massive, and we are focusing on the diagnosis that you cannot see, but we are going to be dabbling a little bit in physical as well, just to really demonstrate and hit home some of the points. Now, what are we actually covering today? So we're going to look at the journey to classification. Why do we even have diagnoses? Are they even important? Are they the future? So many of you are currently going through the process. What is the actual point of it? We're going to look at a history of psychiatric classifications. We're going to be looking at this big, beefy book called the DSM. I'll pronounce later in a minute, and the different revisions. We have been tweaking all the time. We're going to be asking, can you create a diagnosis or classification? Yes, but can you also delete a classification? Can you say, actually, this isn't real anymore and obliterate it from history? Yes. And this is where we get a little bit controversial. Did you know, well, maybe some of you did, that it was a clinical disorder to be homosexual in one of the original variations? I think it was a DSM-2. So you think, I don't know. And then you got things like autism, which are still seen as a disorder today, but some people are rejecting that and saying, no, that doesn't represent how I see it. So it is a fluid document and it is changing slowly, that may I say. We've also got the critics, people who think, they're good, they aren't good. Some of us, I'd love to know your thoughts, see diagnosis as a kind of necessary evil. I personally don't like it, but I appreciate that without it, I'd be in a worse off situation. We're going to be clarifying illnesses, disorder, injuries, and disorder. And this might help us understand when we talk about things like autism, ADHD, etc., how can we feel confident that what we have isn't something which is inherently wrong with us and is just a different way of being? If it is just a different way of being, does it deserve to be in this massive book of disorders? You tell me. and also different diagnosis and the limitations. How far can we go with a diagnosis? Great, you're diagnosed with ADHD, but what can it do for you and what can it not do for you? So Andrew says, are they disorders or neurodiversities? Well, this is the thing, because your terminology will decide how you treat this and how you look at it. If we're looking at like how our manuals refer to it, they do refer to it as a disorder. And neurodiversities is a relatively new terminology in these things, and it doesn't overly address them in that kind of way. So please do not feel that I'm pushing my views on this. This is just the state at where we are now. And as we know, some areas of science can be quite slow to adopt. So yeah, definitely good point. Now let's start off with the bare basics. What even is a classification? So I want you to think, are there any things that you like to sort out? This just so happens to be quite a typical autistic characteristic. I love collecting things, rocks, sticks, Pokemon, maybe you like just collecting pictures of trains. Tell me what you might collect or classify. Some people might like to classify their game library. Other people put their books in a sorted order. Others might collect types of matchsticks and making sure they're all pretty coloured. Nice, we've got fountain pens. Yes, you could classify them. Rocks and fossils, that's definitely a good one. Definitely like using Latin names in order to make sure they're universal across the world. Bookmarks, nice. Sports equipment, what other ones? We've got stamps in a stamp collection book, rocks and minerals in a geological collection or display case, plants and flowers in a botanical garden. Yes, very true. Butterflies and insects. We got buttons, nice. Alphabetical DVDs. There is something quite satisfying about getting things in alphabetical order. But here's my point. Do you do it alphabetical or do you prefer color or images? Because I call it a library. It's a small bookshelf, but I like to put my books in color order, which a lot of people find quite chaotic, and it's not a people pleaser. However, it is still a way of classifying them. Oh, Marie says books go in size order. Yes, that's also quite satisfying when you see like the ascent or descent. When they're all over the place, it's chaos. Information, links and folders, yes, on your computers, DVDs. So as we know, it is a very normal, very human thing to classify. In order to put things in nice little boxes, it's something that as human beings, we like to do. It makes sense of our very messy world. So though a lot of people say, I hate being put in a box. Again, there is benefits to putting things in boxes. So again, I'm not going to say whether having a diagnosis is right or wrong. It's understanding all the perspectives. Spreadsheets for many things, nice. Oh, wow, closed spreadsheets. Fictional books have to be grouped by author, yeah. And that's another thing I don't get. When you're grouping things, who thinks if a book or a DVD starts with the, does that go in the T section or does it go with whatever follows after the? That's an area I've always found rather confusing when I'm trying to find something. Like, say I'm trying to find a book on the Beatles, which is something I'd probably likely do. Am I looking for the Beatles or am I looking for Beatles? Yeah. Oh, Thomas, it's a great question. And I do find it depends where you go. Oh, there is so much overlap between autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and many neurodivergent folk meet criteria for all, and surely better to have a profile of neurodivergence rather than multiple DXs. That is a really good point. And that is something I've often wondered. Am I trying to collect all of them, which it feels like at the moment, or do I just need a kind of a blanket one that I think differently and as a result may do some things easier and some things more challenging? The DSM has been so influenced by pharmacological industries, spot on that one, and we'll tackle that a little bit later, and is not based on clinical science by opinion. The boxes are helpful for most of us, and medication has harmed many of us. Very, very good point. That is very poignant. We've got all the Beatles. I have used my closed spreadsheet to show in charts. I have 47% more t-shirts than any other item. Wow. I don't do that. Probably should, though. It would definitely help me organize my life. So next, how are psychiatric disorders classified? And when we talk about psychiatrics, it means a problem that disturbs a person's thoughts, feelings, or like mental well-being. So you could easily say that when we're talking about most neurodivergent ways of being, we're not talking about psychiatric. However, this is what we're going to be using for this exercise because, again, it gets a bit blurry. Okay, so most of you have said symptoms. And yes, let's see. Symptoms is the correct way. So we can't do it by pathogens, a virus, because you guessed it, there aren't any. The autism virus doesn't exist. Causes, smoking, for instance, doesn't give you autism. You do it by looking at how someone interacts with the world around them and see, what potential difficulties, and typically is quite a negative process that the person may have in this world. So now understanding disease. And before you get your pitchforks out, I'm not saying being neurodiverse is a disease. We already covered that in a previous webinar. But in order to understand what it is, we also have to understand what it isn't and why it isn't. So how well do you understand these diseases? And do you think they're always a disease? So we've got infections. On this, you just write. So if you think like, yeah, definitely disease, or I know it 100%, you might give it a 5. If you have no idea what it is, keep it to a 0. So we've got infections, we've got cancers, diabetes, arthritis, asthma. There's a good chat in the description about alphabetizing clothes and sorting them out. Okay, so a lot of you understand arthritis. Yeah, the struggle is real. It runs in the family. Cancers, infections, nice. And obviously, none of you know them 100%. And this is where having a diagnosis may well and truly come in handy. Because what separates cancer from arthritis or diabetes from infections? We know they're very different. But how do we know they're different? By symptoms. And those symptoms are classified in a nice book. So we're seeing how having a diagnosis for things like diseases is quite useful. And it kind of is a hard and fast rule. Whether or not someone has dyslexia or dyspraxia, maybe that can be more blurred because of comorbidity, but typically you'd either have cancer or arthritis. Obviously you can have both, but typically when you're going to doctors to get kind of like diagnosed, it's normally for one condition at a time, normally. Now, this is where I want to really push you on questioning what is something? Is it a disease, a disorder, or is it just is what it is? So I don't know if any of you have heard Alison Lapper. She is, I believe you would say quadriplegic, or maybe not. Well, she has phocomelia, deafness, and autism. And she, you would say, is disabled. Now, you could classify her by all the things that she has wrong with her or all the deficits. But you may also know that she is a phenomenal artist. She was featured on the 4th Plymouth in Trafalgar Square. She's a parent and a successful one at that. And she was also awarded an MBE. So arguably, she has achieved more in her life than many people who do not have any barriers holding them back. Would you say someone like Alison is a disease? No. Would you say that they are disordered or disabled? Or, how do you explain someone like Alison who has done so well in life? And could you argue she did it despite her differences, or did she do it because of her differences that propelled her, that changed her mindset? What defines disease and how is it different from a disorder? Well, from my understanding, a disease is something which you gain and is bad. It's something that attacks you, not a good thing. Where a disorder is how the brain like processes. So it's not working in the correct way. One is not working in the correct way, and one is something which is actively attacking you or is something external. I'm sure it's defined differently, but that's normally how I look at it. So a lot of you have said she's just being herself. Some of you, one of you said it's a disorder. It changes depending who you look. Oh, UK Review of Mental Health Act has recommended autism and learning disabilities is removed as criteria for civil detention and compulsory treatment. How will this impact on access to health services? Very, very good question. And I'm not sure yet, but it's a good question. Now let's do some questions, right? Let's redefine what is normal and what's not normal. So let's start off with obesity. Is obesity a normal part of being human, just part of who we are, or is it something which is abnormal? Because if something is abnormal, well, then does it need a diagnosis? Is it then a disorder if it's abnormal? If it's normal, then do we need to do anything about it? You can see why this could be quite problematic, because if you compare autism and obesity, which is probably not something you thought you would do today, well, is autism abnormal? Well, it's not the norm compared to the majority of the population, so it gets a label. But for those who think it's normal and it's just a part of being human, does that mean we don't have to make any adjustments? But when we're looking at it from an obesity perspective, well, we know being obese isn't healthy, but we also know that it's very, very common and people can live very happily, and it's also a personal choice. I know those things don't line up perfectly, but it still gets you thinking about what do we consider a disease, a disorder, a difference, or neither? Oh, Anna says, could it be that obesity is just a symptom? Yeah, I suppose so. But a symptom of what? I guess that could vary. And some people, for instance, can't help but gain weight. Other people can help gain weight. Some people with Tourette's can kind of control their tics. Others definitely cannot. It's hard to obtain, these things. Penny says autism is atypical, but autistic people are not abnormal. Yes. And I know the word abnormal is, it's not a great word, but, hopefully you understand why we're using it in this context. Thomas says, depends on what you mean by choice. Also, actions made unconsciously in response to a trauma isn't necessarily a choice. Very true. Andrew, there is a difference from being overweight than obese when it affects the individual's health. Yes, that's true. There's many people who are arguably overweight, but are fine. Just food for thought. Yeah, and honestly, it's a safe environment here today. I will say I won't always get everything right. I will sometimes use clunky language, but this is why we're here, isn't it? To kind of learn and develop together. Osteoporosis. This is a condition about having weak bones. It's like really brittle, likely to shatter, more likely to get like hairline splinters. Is this normal or abnormal? Now, most of you have said abnormal, but let me question this a bit more, because osteoporosis is a medical condition which bones become weak and brittle, making them more prone to fractures. It is a common condition, particularly in older adults, that affect both men and women. This is really common. A lot of people have this. I don't know the statistics, but it's a very, very common thing. So is it still abnormal if it's extremely common? Or Marie says this is both. Sometimes it occurs naturally and sometimes as a result of treatment of other conditions. Yeah, that's a really good point, Marie. You can see how things become very blurry. But would you want to call it normal when your bones are getting weak? No. But if it's something which is widespread common, like the human body isn't built perfect. Now, is that an abnormality or is that just who we are? Homosexuality, is it normal or abnormal? Now, this is obviously a very toxic, problematic question, okay? And hear me out while I explain why we're talking about it. So, yes, and I'm glad all of you have said normal. It is normal. Having your sexuality is just part of who you are. I am not an expert in it, so I'm not going to go into detail. But the reason I ask is homosexuality wasn't always considered normal. It wasn't always considered just who you are. It was considered a disorder, a disease. It was considered abnormal. So now we're starting to look at, well, we all have our personal views on how things are, but we also know that things are changing over time. Things can go from something which is wrong and sinful to something which is healthy and natural. It's interesting how things are changing. Penny says, getting older is universal and associated with increasing fragilities and failing health, but entirely normal. Yes, Penny, that's a really good point as well. What is diagnosis for? So which of these do you agree or disagree? We've got predictions about the future. Do you use a diagnosis in order to find out what the future may hold? Do you use it to reduce a problem we must know what it is, a tool for understanding, or identifying the spread of disease? Now let's see what all of you have put. Oh, Andrew says, I know you have done this for discussion, but I don't like describing something as abnormal. Something can be very common, but isn't odd or abnormal. And Andrew, I completely agree with you. These are just the words when I was doing like the papers that they were referring to. Again, they were referring to it in a very kind of like clinical, stale, not very like human-centric side. So I do agree with you. And it says, I wish neurodiversity got similar recognition as something normal. And this is what I'm really questioning here. I am not saying I think any of these are abnormal, but these are questions which have come up time and time again. So we're hopefully seeing it from multiple perspectives, not necessarily the right one. All right, so we've got a diagnosis is used for predicting the future. If you know that you have something, you know that you might have challenges later down the line. Having ADHD, for example, it helps you know that you might struggle with future activities or things in life, as you progress. To reduce a problem, we must know what it is. It is very true. You try to support for something that you have no name or idea for. This is why I'm slightly against abolishing labels altogether. A tool for understanding, yep, and to identify the spread of disease. Now, I would probably scrap the word disease and just identify what it would be spread. But knowing are things kind of going around the world? Is it something like coronavirus where you got to monitor? Or if we're looking at it from a neurodiverse perspective, autism, obviously it's not a disease, but are we noticing that it's on the rise? We know there's many, many reasons why things are on the rise, such as better education, high diagnosis, but it is still something that is worth keeping an eye on. We've got, Thomas says, just adding this to the mix, what about normal versus natural? In society, we normalize things when perhaps they are not always natural. Oh, Thomas, I like that. That's a very interesting question. Like, for instance, if we're going back to, I guess normal is a very societal thing, where natural, I like that. That's a much better way of putting it. Okay, now for a brief history of classification. How do we get here? How do we get to the point now where we can look at it? So back in the century 3500 Babylonia, they did description on clay tablets, which were accurate for the day about disorders and neurological ways of being and thinking. So even then, they were still documenting it. They were still very aware that people who acted or responded in certain ways, they were kind of grouped together. So kind of sorting people out is not new by any means. Penny just says everyone with an autistic diagnosis are different and gave an individual profile of atypical experience and impairments. Nice. In the 14th century, when we had common law, they distinguished between lunacy and idiocy. And now we use these words quite, you're lunatic, you idiot. But they actually had different meanings. They were legal differences. So if you were a lunatic, you could get better. But if you were an idiot, you would not get better. obviously we don't use these words like this anymore, but it's interesting that these things aren't just being documented in a book now, they're actually becoming legal. And in the 1960s, the UK and the US started creating these manuals, which kind of started the DSM. Now we're going to talk more about the DSM, and you will notice we often talk about DSM-3 upwards. 1 and 2, they weren't that good. Number 3 is when they started to actually put a little bit of research into it and be a worthwhile, meaningful document. Now, I want to read this quote to you from Aubrey Lewis. He was the first director Institution of Psychiatry. Now, in essence, it's about understanding clear language which the general public can understand. So he said, the public clarification is likely to be one that will not lead to any ambiguity. We should eschew categories based on theoretical concepts and restrict ourselves to the operational descriptive types of classification. So let's break it down. What is Aubrey actually saying? The public classification is likely to be one that will not lead to any ambiguity. So we want something which is clear cut, yes, no, black or white, 1 or 0. We don't want any kind of grey area in this. We should eschew categories based on theoretical concepts and restrict ourselves to the operational descriptive type of classification. So we're saying this shouldn't be based on our personal opinion. We shouldn't be like, yeah, autism. We should have like a guide which can help us define what it is. So there's some consistency amongst individuals, regions, countries, and hopefully, ideally, the world in order to help people and monitor it. And this is what kickstarted the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, it has come in a long way. We kickstarted in 1952. The DSM-1 was awful. It wasn't, wasn't that good. DSM-2 came a fair few years later in 68. Again, not a great book, to be honest with you. Homosexuality was a disorder. There was a lot of other kind of areas. And though these books existed, no one read them. They weren't widespread. When you think of disorders now, this is the go-to book. This is like the Bible. But it wasn't. So 1 and 2, meh. But then number 3 kicked in. And just like Grand Theft Auto, this is when the games start to get interesting. So in 1980, we introduced explicit diagnostic criteria. This is when they started to actually think about things that were in there. And this is when the book started to gain popularity. This is when insurance companies would say, okay, you can gain XY benefit if it is in this book. There's lots of kind of interesting things. Again, not a perfect book. It is very flawed. We've also got, in the next one, the 4th edition, it was more of the same but different. Though we are getting different editions, it's not necessarily adding any value. Why do they make new editions if they're not adding any value? That sweet, sweet moolah. These books are expensive. They're like 80 quid a book. So the more they make, the more money they're going to make. So it's in their advantage to release new and updated versions. And in the DSM-5, we were hoping this was going to be a big book, right? Because we are doing like genomes, sequencing, we're doing like head scans. We're hoping that we can completely re-rate what it means to have a diagnosis. However, all these amazing hopes about creating this kind of like new frontier of having diagnoses which are backed by technology and our DNA didn't work. The technology just wasn't there. So they had to make a couple adjustments, but it wasn't what we all hoped for. Okay, Penny has said, let's see what you've... actually, we've got a few different comments here. Many autistic women diagnosed with personality disorder due to gender nature of diagnostic decision-making. Yes, Penny. The diagnostic manual is inherently biased. And a lot of the kind of criteria were based on white male perspectives. So it definitely isn't representative of everyone. We got James Davis' book, Cracked, gives an excellent critical account of the DSM and shows how invalid it is. Oh, nice, I'll check that out. And Sarah says, not sure if you've come across it, but the power threat meaning framework, PTMF, is an alternative framework to the DSM for people to use to develop non-psychiatric diagnostic blame narratives. I haven't heard of that, but I will check that out. Oh, Thomas said, 69% of the DSM-5 task force members reported having ties to the pharmacological industries. Yeah, so about that, this book is used as the be-all and end-all. It really, really shouldn't be. You know, people are told whether or not they can get healthcare, whether or not they can have help in schools or kind of the workplace based on a book which is inherently flawed. Is it the best we got at the moment? I don't know, but it is what we have at the moment. But please do not take this as gospel. It is not. It is a book which is forever changing, be it slowly, and it is a book which can and does get things wrong. Just remember, homosexuality was a disorder. I'm not like this book is very, very, very different from where it was, but it's worth knowing that things are always changing. Like autism used to have autism and Asperger's, then got rid of Asperger's, and now it's just ASD. It is changing. So what is an advantage of having a descriptive classification? This is where I'm chucking it back to you, and feel free to let me know. We talked about the pros and the cons, but what is the benefit of having a book like the DSM? All right, nice. Let's see what we got. Penny says, the problem with the PTMF, which we just spoke about, is a clinical formation imposed narrative on distressed individuals rather than supporting them to explore their own narrative of what has happened to them and how it has impacted on them. Wow, great comment, Penny. Also, you know, I'm dyslexic, right? That was so difficult to read, but I love your language. Very, very well put. We've got it is listed types of neurodiversity in different categories. I mean, interestingly, these comments aren't flowing in. I'm guessing you're like struggling to think of the advantages. There are advantages. So please don't feel I'm bashing it 100%. It's understanding the pros and cons. We got hopefully a consistency across diagnosis. Yes, even if they're not 100% concrete, having some sort of consensus. Like imagine if like you get, okay, you have this condition, you get all of this support, you have the same condition, but you live over there, you get less. That kind of is how it is already, but the idea is to avoid that. So at least it has well-meaning hopes, right? I guess. All right, so Mr. David Kupfer, who was the head of the DSM-5 planning committee, sounded like a great committee. Would have loved to be a fly on the wall on that one. He was talking about a descriptive classification system that is reliable compared to older. So even David, who was like the head of the committee, agrees that it's not perfect, but it's better than what came before it. So he says, the major advantage of adopting a descriptive classification was its improved reliability. I think that's a key word here, improved, over prior classification systems using non-operationalized definitions of disorders based on unproven etymological assumptions. Oh, I'm struggling with the reading with this today. But again, I admire him for this because it is well-meaning, and it's very much saying that each edition should improve on the last, but it is not a final destination. Now, a question back to you all again. The label ASD, autism spectrum disorder, helps professionals know, ... What do you think that this label helps people know? Oh, Marie says you are doing great. These are big and unusual words. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, we've got 50% of you says an intervention that will be helpful. Not, yeah, again, you wouldn't want a label that's not helpful. That is a very good point. Your professional background, is it going to tell you how successful you're going to be in life? Your biology or your heritability? Now, interestingly, most of you there, but some put your heritability. So I want to break this down, all right? It is the first one. The label is meant to add value. It's meant to allow you to access different areas of support. Now, this label, it doesn't tell you your future. You could be successful. You can not be successful, arguably. It doesn't determine your place in society. Only society does that. It doesn't tell you about your biology. Well, it arguably does, but it doesn't actually. It's just a word or a bit of paper. You have X, Y, Z. You would have to do more research in order to get the biology. So you could argue yes, but not really. Like, I have been diagnosed with dyslexia. I didn't get anything breaking down my biology. And lastly, heritability, which means, it runs in the family. Well, we know things like ASD does run in the family, but the diagnosis doesn't tell you that. It doesn't say that you got this from your mum, or 85% of it is likely due to your great-great aunt. It doesn't say, well, it wouldn't be your aunt, would it? It would be grandmother. But it doesn't say that. So it is mainly that one. Okay. Anna says, yes, it's our interpretation of what we know, not how things really are. Very true. So the DSM-5 autistic diagnostic criteria, this is just, a small bit. It's not the full criteria, but this is kind of how it describes autism. So out of these 3 points, which one of these would you kind of resonate with yourself? And maybe it's all of them, but what is the one that you primarily resonate with? We've got deficits in social, emotional reciprocity, deficits in nonverbal communicative behavior, or deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. Michaela says, unfortunately, it's necessary to get proper educational help in schools, regardless of what the law says. Yes. Now, all of these things you normally need to have in order to get a diagnosis of autism. Now, this is quite clear-cut, but we also know it's a spectrum. So where's the cutoff line? There is an element of discretion in all of this. So though the aim is to make it clear-cut, things like autism, they don't really allow for things to be clear-cut. So most of you have said you resonate with having deficits in social emotional, and one of you had deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. Now, you might notice here the word deficit. That is an inherently negative word. A diagnosis kind of has to be negative because it's about what is stopping you from performing to your best or in the world. Now, that may be something which is something that you can't help or can help. In terms of autism, it's something that is just you're likely to struggle due to whatever reasons, but they are quite negative and not the most uplifting. And this is one of the reasons why some people don't agree with it. Now, this is a really tough question, and if any of you don't have an answer, I understand. Why do some people with autism achieve independence while others do not? So autism, ASD, is a category. It's something you can get diagnosed with. It tries to be as binary as possible. But if it is a single diagnosis, though admittedly there are different levels, why can some people achieve completely independent, seemingly normal lives, and other people might be dependent upon healthcare and support systems? It's a spectrum. Nice. There are many factors, in my opinion. I guess it depends which areas are affected more than others in a person. Michaela says, Gilbert in Sweden does not use a clear-cut approach, instead talks about essence. If you have ADHD, dyslexia, they can together cause enough issues, it should be addressed. Oh, interesting. I'll have to research more about that. Because it depends on how affected the person is by the ASD. No. So, already we're starting to pull it apart. That it's about how it affects you. To those who achieve independence can also communicate verbally. But then again, some people cannot communicate verbally, but also have independence. It's why when we had these terms of high functioning, low functioning, they just were not helpful. So as you can see, The diagnosis is helpful in some regards, but if someone just told you you had ASD, does it tell you enough information? Does it tell other people how to support you? True. Oh, that's an altruism. Oh yeah, Andrew says, I heard recently, if you have met one person with autism, you have met one person with autism. It's a true point, but yet the diagnosis is the same. Yeah, really interesting, everyone. So here are some questions which I think need answering ASAP. How to validate diagnosis without clear pathology. So what this is we can't like cut someone's brain open. We can't do the scans. We can't take a bit of their DNA. Like that does not exist at the moment, at least. So how can we truly diagnose something and make sure it's valid and it's accurate? How do we categorize autism disorders? So we know that the spectrum is huge. How do we categorize it? We used to have like Asperger's, classic autism. You have things like level 1, level 2. None of them are perfect. So is there a better way of doing it? And how do we deal with comorbidity? Now, interestingly, who mentioned it? One of you mentioned, of the different approaches. And if you have dyslexia and ADHD, then your characteristics, symptoms, traits, whatever you want to call it, aren't going to match up with someone who only has ADHD. So it's why when comorbidity or co-occurrence comes into factor, it can kind of skew the results a bit. And we know, like, is the aim of collecting them all? Are teachers or professionals meant to understand what all these kind of like, if this plus this equals this? I don't know. These are like the hard questions to answer and the ones that we still need to think about. Now, this is where anti-psychiatry came in. It's a bit of an old thing. It was mainly in the 60s and 70s, but they were like, no, we reject psychiatry. These ways of diagnosing people are not cool. And though it has kind of fallen out of fashion, it's still an interesting kind of perspective to look at. So it was R.D. Laing, he wrote in the book The Divided Self, and he talks about psychosis isn't a medical condition, but tension between different aspects. So it was a different way of deconstructing what it means to have a disorder. Obviously, he's talking about psychosis in this part, but it's still interesting. Psychosis is not a medical condition, but an outcome of the divided self, of the tension between two personas within us. One, our authentic, private identity, and the other, the false, sane self that we present to the world. It's just really interesting. Try and break it down as best you can, but I want you to read this and then answer this question I'm going to propose to you next. What I believe Laing is saying is that maybe some people who have psychosis or like mental conditions are arguably more saner than those who do not have them because their brain is being more authentic. Now, yes, a lot of you are saying no, and I would probably definitely go with no too. But it's still interesting that he's proposing this idea, which puts you to like reevaluate what it means to have a condition such as psychosis. Now, these are some different statements. I want to find out your own opinions. What ones do you believe? So these are all points which the anti-psychiatry movement stated. So what about mental illness doesn't exist? Do you agree or disagree? I see a lot of you disagree, where anti-psychiatry would, it doesn't exist. Proper illness has a clear-cut pathological basis. So for instance, when we say proper illness, if you've got like a cancer, arthritis, these things is very clear-cut. You either have it or you don't have it. Fewer mental disorders have a clear-cut pathological basis, such as things like autism, depression, anything that you can't see is never going to be clear-cut. A lot of you agree. A mental illness language is metaphorical. So when we use these like languages, it's about helping people to understand. We're converting it. It's not an accurate description. Okay. Anna says comorbidity is interesting because you only have spectrum of symptoms, but also share percentages between them and how they impact each other. Definitely. Helen says, I often talk about putting on a mask to be able to cope with going out. Yeah, Helen, that's a great example of how it could be used as a metaphor. Helpful, but not particularly accurate. So the clear problem with psychiatry is that the practice shouldn't be dependent on diagnosis. It just shouldn't be, but it is. Poor validity amongst psychiatric diagnosis, meaning how trustworthy is it? Do we really trust it? The effectiveness of pharmacological treatments. And we know that the pharmacological industry is not the most trustworthy. And do they actually work when we know money is behind it? Diagnosis shouldn't be used to justify civil detention. And one of you they very much stated that diagnosis shouldn't be used for detention, and yet it has been. And diagnostic constructs don't add much to scientific knowledge. By diagnosing people, do we get much benefit from it? What does it add to the discussion? Arguably, not much. Now, I appreciate I'm getting a bit tight to the curb, so I'll try and wrap this up, but these are some really interesting points. Peter Kinderman, sounds like a Kinder egg, bless him. Kinderman, really a great guy, says this in his book, A Manifesto for Mental Health. If psychiatry is not the answer, what is? With a problem definition formation, what would you prioritize? So what do you think is the most important? Do you think the problems are the most important, the circumstances, the origins, or the solution? So for instance, let's say autism, problems, communicating with society, circumstances, you live in a economically deprived area, origins, like where it initiated from. Was it through birth? Did you kind of nature v nurture? Interesting, really interesting points. Now, Peter said this, we need a wholesale revision of the way we think about psychological distress. We should start by acknowledging that such distress is normal, not abnormal, part of human life. Hopefully you can see why I was using the term abnormal before, because this is what he used. We're not saying it's abnormal. Distress is normal. The human response to difficult circumstances by becoming distressed. Again, interesting way of looking at it. Whether you agree or not, that's up to you. Problems with formation-based. How can you learn if everything you do is based at an individual level? You know, the classic iceberg approach. When we're diagnosing people, we're looking at the tip of the iceberg, but there is so much more that we aren't taking into consideration. So our observations can never be truly accurate. Another quote, which is quite useful, is from Stephan Heckers. He says, the true value of a psychiatric diagnosis is the ability to predict course of illness, response to treatment, and ultimately quality of life and level of function in society. Good clinical use of diagnosis in the service of best practical care. So you can see there are people who are starting to think and start to revise. But this beast is huge. When we know that DSM, the big dog, has funding back to pharmacological companies, is it really ever going to change? So to round up, when it comes to getting diagnosis, there are limitations. There are limitations of contemporary diagnosis systems. I'm not saying they're all bad, but it's worth to know that they don't answer everything. Stigma. Diagnosis is associated with stigma. Though there are benefits to it, some people don't want to have that label because of the baggage that it comes with. And positives. There are value as well. I am not by any means saying that a diagnosis is bad. Without it, a lot of us would not be where we are today and wouldn't have the help and support we need. There is still definitely benefit in it. And he just said, problems with labeling people with disorders is the tendency to want to cure neurodivergent conditions rather than helping them to navigate life as themselves. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a problem by society. Or Anna says, yeah, coaching and coping strategies are underrated. Definitely, like our systems do encourage medical interventions rather than more softer, holistic approaches. Whew. Well, there we are, we're done. But I always have to mention this at the end because it's what we do at the end of the day. If any of you are neurodivergent and in work and in the UK, do pick up the old dog and bone for us, because we do have help where we can do free workplace needs assessments. And the best thing about them is you do not need to be diagnosed. You just have to resonate with the difference. Like if you resonate with autism and some of the challenges which you attribute to autism resonate in yourself, then you would be eligible mostly. Obviously, terms and conditions apply. So do have a look at that. We've got some questions that we've answered, thankfully, though I've really appreciated your discussions. And if you enjoyed today, please come back next week. Next week, we're doing stigma and neurodiversity. Now, people kept asking me, is Stephen Fry neurodiverse? No, I don't think he is, but he is a massive advocate for stigma and mental health. And we're applying the same kind of thoughts that go behind how to overcome stigma of mental health and applying that same logic to overcoming stigma in neurodiversity. And as a result, diagnosis. We have a lovely YouTube channel, so if you like today or you want to catch up on our previous ones, do check out our YouTube channel. You know, we've got a lovely link here, or you can just Google us. And here are our contact details if you want to get in contact, seek help, and etc., etc. This was a big old session, lots of words, but I really hope you enjoyed it. And thank you so much for attending as always. And hopefully I'll see you again next week, everyone. Nice, Ria. Thanks. I love this. Brilliant. Michaela, appreciate it. Thanks, Danny. Oh, Helen, is bipolar divergent? I would say yes. Thanks so much. Okay, brilliant. All right, everyone. See you soon and have a great rest of your day. Bye.